It's Friday, June 5th. It's been a huge week in Montana and across the world, and we appreciate you spending a bit of time with MCVcast. I'm Aaron Murphy, Executive Director of Montana Conservation Voters, along with Deputy Director Whitney Tawney and Political Director Jake Brown. Today we'll be addressing the worldwide demand for racial justice and equity, a movement that has boiled over following last week's murder of George Floyd under the knee of a white police officer. The sounds you are hearing now are from Lafayette Square on Monday in Washington, D.C., when federal officers removed protesters from the park they own, using tear gas, rubber bullets, and brutal physical force. Lafayette Square, by the way, is a national park, which means it's open to everyone who wants to peacefully exercise their First Amendment rights. And that's what was happening when Donald Trump decided to visit historic St. John's Episcopal Church, uninvited and unannounced, for a photo op.
Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Robin Saha, an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Climate Change Studies at the University of Montana. Robin is a leading environmental justice scholar and an activist. He's also the president of the board of directors for the Montana Conservation Voters Education Fund.
Yeah, Whitney, we'll be talking to Robin about why racial justice and equity is linked closely with the conservation voter movement. While it may be obvious to some, others find it helpful to understand why environmental justice is racial justice. I've learned a lot from Robin over the past year, and we look forward to having him help us unpack what's happening and what you can do to affect important change wherever you live. Of course, it's been a big week for politics in Montana, too, with another primary election in the rearview mirror. That means it was a very big week for Jake Brown. Before we get to today's discussion, Jake, what are the key takeaways from Tuesday?
Well, first of all, a record number of Montanans made their voices heard last Tuesday in the primary election. And fortunately for us, that means 100% of MCV endorsed candidates also made it through their primary elections and will advance to the general election in November. Here's a quick rundown on little preview for the general election ballot. In the race for the U.S. Senate, Governor Steve Bullock will face Montana's junior Senator Steve Daines, who actually led the charge on the largest reduction of protected public lands in Montana history.
Senator Daines is getting a lot of credit these days for the Land and Water Conservation Fund finally having some momentum and looking like it's going to be permanently and fully funded. As a reminder, Senator Tester is also an original co-sponsor of that legislation. But just working on LWCF doesn't make you a public lands champion. Here at MCV, we expect more. So if Senator Daines wants to be a champion for our public lands, he shouldn't be supporting a public lands foe heading up the Bureau of Land Management. He shouldn't be leading efforts to release wilderness study areas without the consultation of Montanans. And he most certainly shouldn't be writing letters asking the Interior Department to stop collecting the oil and gas royalties that make the Land and Water Conservation Fund possible.
Yeah, that's right, Whitney. In the race for Montana's only seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, former state legislator Kathleen Williams will face failed 2018 U.S. Senate candidate Matt Rosendale, a Maryland transplant who has repeatedly called for the transfer and sale of our public lands.
Let's not forget Matt Rosendale plus Montana politics equals a game of musical chairs. He first ran for Congress back in 2014, losing in the primary election to Ryan Zinke. So Rosendale ran for state auditor in 2016 and won, but just a few short months into his 4-year term, he announced his run for the U.S. Senate against Senator Tester, and as Jake mentioned, despite getting Donald Trump to visit Montana 4 times on taxpayer dime, he lost. Maybe that's because Matt Rosendale skipped a debate, misused taxpayer dollars, and had to defend his support for selling off public lands, and had a pretty tough time even trying to pronounce the name of our state. Now he's running for Congress again.
Rafe Graybill, Bullock's chief legal counsel, won his competitive primary and will face former state representative Austin Knutson in the race for Montana Attorney General. Knutson and his family made waves in northeastern Montana when they sued to block access to a public veterans park in Culbertson. Murph, Whitney, does that remind you of anyone else? State legislator Shane Morgeau won his primary election and will go up against Troy Downing in the state auditor's race. Downing was actually convicted of poaching when he lied about his California residency to buy in-state hunting license. Candidate for Secretary of State Bryce Bennett didn't have a primary opponent, but we did learn who his general election opponent will be. Christy Jacobson won the 6-way competitive Republican primary and will face Bennett in the general. Christie is the chief of staff for Corey Stapleton, so it'll be interesting to watch how she talks about some of the blunders that have happened in that office in the past 4 years. Monica Trinnell, candidate for the Public Service Commission District 4, won her contested primary and will be up against a familiar name to the conservation world, Jennifer Fielder. Fielder has been one of the most outspoken proponents of a federal lands transfer and is the CEO of the American Lands Council.
Let it also be clear that although Fielder may have worked on some net metering legislation in the state capitol as a legislator, she does not have a background in energy. In fact, this is so out of left field, or should I say right field, that it looks suspiciously like she is trying to just get the PSC salary so she can continue to visit her friend in Texas, country singer Randy Travis. Remember how she got in trouble this last session because she missed a full week of votes and didn't hold hearings as the chair of the Fish and Game Committee for most of the month of January because of a trip down south to visit her friend. That may sound like I'm picking on her, but Montana's legislative session is only 90 days, so missing a week matters.
Yeah, that's right, Whitney. I think generally we're excited that all of our endorsed candidates won their primaries, but it's also just worth noting that every single one of their opponents has an absolutely terrible record on public lands and conservation. This is, without a doubt, one of the most anti-public lands and anti-access tickets that we've seen, and I think we're going to have a lot of work cut out for us in order to make sure the right candidates win in November.
We launched MCVcast in early April of 2020. We realized Montanans weren't hearing important developments affecting conservation amid the COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we're coming to terms with another defining story impacting all of us, the call for real systemic change and injustice following a police officer's murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis.
Because just like at one era, we had to fight slavery, another era we had to fight Jim Crow, another era we dealt with voting rights. This is the era to deal with policing and criminal justice. We need to go back to Washington and stand up, black, white, Latino, Arab, in the shadows of Lincoln and tell them this is the time to stop this.
Of course, we are hearing that outcry in cities across Montana: Bozeman, Missoula, Billings, Helena, Havre. Thousands of Montanans are raising their voices to demand justice. They don't want talking points. They don't want thoughts and prayers. They're not turning to the echo chamber of Twitter and Facebook. They're demanding real justice. To all who are courageously being part of this change, we at MCV see you. We are bearing witness to all of it, and we are with you. Today's guest, Dr. Robin Saha. Robin is an expert in environmental justice and the president of the MCV Education Fund's board of directors. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Aaron. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you. So before we begin, I'd like to rewind back to last October when all of us were sitting in a hotel conference room discussing MCV's priorities. Robin, I'd like to read a bit from our new strategic plan. It says, and I'm quoting, "We commit to working with diverse partners and actively inviting people to work, always striving for racial justice, equity, and inclusion, and learning from each other in an environment that does not perpetuate or tolerate injustice of any kind." What does that mean?
I think it means that that as MCV as an organization is really striving to think about the organization's role in the larger problems in society and how we can address them through our work, through our mission. And that means that thinking about conservation issues and how they interface with racial justice, with fairness, with ideas of inclusion, of creating a bigger conservation tent, if you will. Those are all part of what conservation organizations around the country are thinking about and beginning to do. And this is an important step for organizations like MCV to really recognize how their work dovetails with a larger racial justice issues, and recognizes also the diversity that we have in our society, and that we're really trying to bring in more people to the conservation movement. And that really has a potential to build power and to to make us more effective in everything we do.
Robin, could you tell us a little bit more about your background? What drew you to this work in the first place?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the '60s, and so I was in Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland. There were race riots, 2 blocks away from us in the Huff area of Cleveland. And, so sort of, I mean, I was a child, but seeing the civil rights movement, I think instilled in me this idea that we can have a more fair and just society. And so throughout my education, I found ways to learn about and to do things that can work towards that goal. First, after college, working in a Catholic youth organization, residential camp in the San Francisco Bay Area that brought kids of all different socioeconomic background, racial and ethnic backgrounds together into a community, a learning community. And then I think the pivotal moment for me, though, was going to graduate school at the University of Michigan, where in the early 90s, where there was just a lot of excitement and a lot of faculty and students that were interested in environmental justice. And the environmental justice movement had, taken off and was really having an effect on government agencies and starting to make those types of changes that, protesters wanted to see. There's of course been a tremendous backlash against that and some stalling of the environmental justice movement, but being around other folks that are learning about, researching, actively engaged as activists in environmental justice was really my training grounds, if you will, for the work I do today.
There's a lot that's been happening across our country, in particular, kind of instigated lately by this George Floyd killing, and it's creating a lot of unrest. We mentioned, I guess, one of the things at the top of the show that racial justice and environmental justice are closely linked. And so how would you take the current events that are going on right now and connect that with environmental justice?
Great question. I was thinking, Whitney and Aaron, too, that some of this this tinderbox, if you will, actually stemmed from the COVID outbreak and the recognition that African Americans, especially, have been hit hard, really hard by the virus. And I think that recognition and the decades and decades of police brutality and a criminal justice system that has huge percentages of African American men in jail for often minor crimes that whites generally don't go to jail for, has really created this sense that things need to change, things need to be reformed. And the real thing that these protesters are saying is that it's not just about George Floyd. It's about a pattern of mistreatment. It's about a pattern of discrimination in the justice system and policing, and beyond that, they're saying that that's just a part of a larger problem of systemic discrimination, and we're talking about whole systems of basically structural disadvantage. So this idea that the way society is set up, our policies, our laws, the way they're carried out, is unfair to people of color, in particular, poor people as well. And they're saying that that's what needs to be changed, and that when we're talking about systemic discrimination, we're talking about disadvantages in education, in housing, disparities in healthcare, in wealth, and so on. And those have a cumulative effect on people. They not only affect people's life chances, their quality of life, their health. They prevent people from often getting out of those situations despite their best efforts. And part of the system, too, is the environmental system, the environmental regulatory system, our preparedness and response to disasters, our handling of pollution, our access to public lands. And so all of those environmental issues and conservation issues that we care about also are systemically disadvantage people of color and low-income communities. And that's exactly what the environmental justice movement has brought to light and fights against. It's also important to look at the history, because systemic discrimination is not something that just showed up today. It's something that's been around since the founding of the country, before the founding of the country, with slavery, with lack of citizenship for Native Americans, lack of ability to vote. We could add women, discrimination against women to some of these issues as well. So if we want to build a more fair and just society, we need to confront systemic discrimination. And in our wheelhouse, conservation and environmental issues are part of those, and they do have a unjust aspect to them as well that is important to take a look at and think about and work on.
Robin, you sent us a clip of Robert Bullard this week, and I listened to it. It's fascinating. I'm about to play it, but wondering if you might set that up for us just a little bit before we hear from him.
Well, Bob Bullard is probably the best known scholar, activist in the environmental justice movement. He's actually been called the godfather of the environmental justice movement, and his scholarship has also led to a lot of governmental attention to the issue and action on the issue.
There are lots of struggles around pesticides and farm workers, around communities that are struggling against highways being built through their communities, and with petrochemical plants, etc. But it was not until Warren County, where that PCB landfill, that toxic waste landfill, was placed in the middle of this predominantly black county. And residents in that community said no, and we started to get people from all over the country, led by Reverend Ben Chavis, who at the time was the executive director of the Commission for Racial Justice at the United Church of Christ, that began to galvanize people and attracted lots of folks to Warren County and to protest that landfill and to talk about this whole idea of environmental injustice and environmental racism. And once we started to see people actually going to jail, over 500 people went to jail over the siting of that landfill. So it became not just an environmental issue, it became a civil rights issue and a human rights issue. And that's when you start to get people from all over the country, African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders, to start to think about this whole idea of everybody has a right to live in an environment that is free from pollution. And no community should become the dumping grounds. And so,
Robin, you earlier mentioned kind of the role of the conservation movement's role in participating in kind of this unjust system that we have. I wanted to acknowledge that our conservation movement is heavily dominated by white people, and I think there's no question that we as a movement benefit from systemic racism. I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the fact that our movement is so heavily dominated by white people and just how we can work to be more inclusive of people of color in our space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's been an issue that's been on the table, called out since the early 1990s, and it's not just here in Montana. It's around the country, and in Montana, we're a predominantly white state, so we're in a little bit of a different situation here. Yet we do have a fair bit of diversity in Montana. If you think about, the state being about 7% American Indian. So in Montana, I think that diversifying the movement means collaborating with, means partnering with, understanding the issues in Indian country, and supporting and working with tribes on conservation environmental issues that matter to them. And it turns out actually that we share many of the same concerns and interests. And, you take things like pipelines. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe had tremendous support from around the country from climate justice activists. We have issues here in Montana with the Keystone pipeline route running right next to Fort Peck Reservation and threatening their water supply if there were to be a spill. There's that. There's also the issue of the man camps going in and all the social problems and risks to tribal communities that go along with them. And, with the attention to missing and murdered Indigenous people, women in particular, there are those potential impacts that come with the construction of the pipeline, not to mention, the risks of a spill. And MCV's been really involved in trying to build those dialogues with the Fort Peck Indian community. That's just, one example of something that concerns all of us and the clean water that we and communities around Montana rely on. The conservation community, including MCV, especially MCV, have been supportive of the Salish, Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes' bid to have the National Bison Range restored to their management. And so, we shouldn't, I guess what I'm saying is we shouldn't necessarily say we're not doing the work, or that we're, because we're, predominantly white, that we're not attuned to those issues and we don't work on them, because we certainly do. But, that doesn't mean we can't do a better job.
So kind of following up on that in particular, because I think there is an opportunity here, what should white people who want to be a part of the change be mindful of, and making sure that we're not moving backwards?
I think that it's important to be mindful that, the issues that tribal communities face, that low-income communities, even take Butte, or Anaconda, white communities, working class white communities that are dealing with contamination and not getting adequate cleanups. They are organizing themselves. They are speaking out in ways that they hadn't in 10, 20 years ago. It's one thing to expect people to support other people's issues, but I think when communities get active on their own issues, that can then provide more momentum or capacity to continue that work, to create a cleaner, healthier, safer environment across the state, and more solidarity with other communities. And the other thing I would add too is that we're raised with, and we hear about when we grow up, different negative portrayals of Native Americans, of other people of color, and those can get instilled in one's consciousness in very subtle ways that can almost be unconscious. It's not just about trying to understand other people. It's often about understanding yourself and your own viewpoints and, judgments that may or may not have merit.
The Atlantic had a piece from General Mattis this week, which is Trump's former defense secretary, where he denounced the president for creating more division in our country than any president that he has known prior. How do you think that the outdoors can bring people together?
I think the outdoors is really a great equalizer in some ways. That we all have the chance to experience it, to experience the renewal and the joy, that the physical exertion, if you will, or just simply the contemplation and the connection to the earth, to places. When we provide opportunities for people to get outdoors, it's almost like a universal good, right? Not everybody has the opportunity to get outdoors, to recreate, and Montana certainly has tremendous opportunities for outdoor recreation, and there are folks that really have a hard time with taking advantage of that, who are, say, single parents or working multiple jobs. So we need to be thinking, not just about continuing to provide access to wild places and places outside the city, but also places within our own communities. And so to really bring people together, we need to have different ways people can get out there. One thing that's really exciting about Missoula is that there is an ordinance that there must be a city park within half a mile of every residence in Missoula, so you can get to them. And so when we start thinking about, outdoor recreation and access from a racial justice lens or economic justice lens, we need to think about our urban parks and providing recreational opportunities in our cities and our rural areas too. I guess I'm sort of curious, Whitney, what you were thinking about that too. I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that why I'm super passionate about our public lands is because of the accessibility. I think that we saw a lot of that happening when President Obama was in office through national monument designations. And what was really neat about that too was that he was designating places that people of all different backgrounds really cared about. But a lot of the time there was kind of some outdoor element to it. Not always, but I think it was a way of honoring kind of that history and bringing people together to understand further about kind of the trauma of what has happened in this country and how to deepen our understanding and also be aware that we do have white fragility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, it's so important that the federal government adequately fund our public lands, our national parks. One thing we do need to, as a conservation movement, need to be working on and aware of is that fewer people are getting outdoors and camping and hunting and recreating. I don't know if that's the case in Montana, but as a nation as a whole, when you don't have that a contact with nature, there's less of a tendency to invest in protecting nature as well.
Robin, as we continue to watch what's happening around the state and country and world with these protests and this call for change, any closing thoughts on your end on what we can do, what we should keep in mind, and how the conservation voter movement is linked with racial justice and equity?
It's worthwhile thinking about that the United States will be majority minority in less than 25 years. And there are several states that are already majority minority, if you will. So this growing diversity really requires that the conservation movement be attuned to the conservation issues and concerns of a diverse electorate, increasingly diverse electorate. And it's actually a tremendous opportunity to build a broader constituency for conservation and an opportunity to build power. And gaining support for and building a broader conservation movement, creating a bigger conservation movement or a bigger tent, if you will, definitely requires understanding the experiences and concerns and in many cases, the historical injustices of people of color. Their viewpoints are very much rooted in their historical experiences of injustice. So in being more successful in the future, conservationists, conservation organizations like MCV will really do well to carry out those statements like the one we started with, and they'll find success in building support for conservation priorities by bringing in those voices that have not always been heard or listened to.
Dr. Robin Saha is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Climate Change Studies at the University of Montana. Robin, thank you for your leadership and for your scholarship and for your time with us today.
You bet, Aaron. It's been great being with all three of you.
Again, Dr. Robin Saha is president of the MCV Education Fund's Board of Directors. The MCV Education Fund is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it's worth reading its mission statement. The Montana Conservation Voters Education Fund engages all Montanans and their communities by empowering them to protect our clean air, clean water, public lands, and voting rights through education, mobilization, and the power of grassroots advocacy.
As always, we cover conservation headlines on our podcast, and to make sure important news doesn't get overlooked, this week we're tracking a few stories like the purchase of 97 acres surrounding C. Ben White fishing access site on the West Fork of the Bitterroot. This purchase will allow for access to adjacent Forest Service land, increased amenities at the access site, and will also prevent the land around the fishing site from being developed into a subdivision. This purchase will allow for access to adjacent Forest Service land, increased amenities at the access site, and will also prevent the land around the fishing site from being developed into a subdivision. This purchase by the state of Montana was made possible by a private landowner and is a great example of conservation in the public interest. The purchase will be in front of the land board for final approval in the coming months. Thanks to the landowner and everybody else who made this purchase possible.
In a late development, President Trump on Thursday quietly signed an executive order to waive environmental regulations to speed up controversial projects like mines, highways, and even pipelines. The reason, he says, is because of the current economic emergency, those are his words, brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a bit of hopeful news as the Trump administration continues to disregard decades of bipartisan laws to protect our clean air, our clean water, and our public health. Developers are expected to have to prove that they are indeed operating in an emergency, something courts get the final say on.
Another blow was dealt to the controversial Keystone XL pipeline as the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court ruled against the Trump administration, which had requested a stay order on the earlier decision, saying that the Army Corps of Engineers had failed to consider impacts on endangered species like pallid sturgeon. The administration requested a stay on the order, citing a pause on the permit program could delay the construction of pipelines needed to deliver important fuel to some critical destinations such as power plants. The two judges ruled against the government and have continued to block the pipeline for now. We'll continue to track this story for our listeners and members in the future.
In better news, Glacier National Park will partially open for recreational access on Monday, June 8th. The West Gate entrance will be open until 4:40 p.m. each day, so visitors can access Apgar and the Going to the Sun Road.
This is episode 10 of MCVcast, which means this show wraps up our very first season. We will be back next week with a bonus episode featuring former Governor Brian Schweitzer. He's always good for some unique insight, and in a couple of weeks we'll be back with season 2. A huge thanks to all of our listeners and financial supporters for making this podcast a success. If you missed an episode, all 10 episodes are available on our brand new website, mtvoters.org. Just click on the podcast button and you'll find links to every episode or wherever you get your podcasts. Please tell your friends about the show, give us a like or review. All of it helps us out.
As we get ready for season 2, we'll have plenty of news to share with you via our social media channels. Please find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at MTVoters, which is MTVOTERS. We're also on YouTube.
I also just want to give a shout out to all of the MCV members who make our organization a success, and especially to the ones who have contributed to our political work through the MCV Action Fund. Thank you, and if you haven't contributed recently, we invite you to do so at mtvoters.org/donate.
For Whitney, Tawney, and Jake Brown, I'm Aaron Murphy. We'll see you very soon, and we'll leave you this week with MCV's endorsed candidate for governor, Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney, addressing voters with his running mate Casey Schreiner after his victory on Tuesday night.
We need to prepare ourselves to run against Greg Gianforte because we know that his vision of Montana is not the vision Montanans want. And it's our job to make sure that that doesn't happen.